Have you ever made a mistake? Of course you have. What's the saying? To err is human. All of us have made mistakes. But when you're working on a creative project, something where momentum and inspiration are key ingredients, making mistakes has a habit of tripping you up and slowing you down. Over the years, as a full-time creative professional, I have made a number of mistakes myself, and I've watched other creators make similar mistakes. And so I want to help you today to get your head around 4 key mistakes that creators make early on in their projects. And hopefully you can learn from them and have a better, smoother path forward. Let's dig in. Hey there, I'm Mahnke, and I make podcasts. Now, for the past 7 years, I've been making a show called Lore, and along the way, I've learned a lot of lessons, most of them by making mistakes. Now, it seems counterintuitive that you should be thankful for mistakes, but in this case, I am. I think that making those mistakes along the way have allowed me to figure out how things should work and a better path forward so that I can pass it on to people like you. So if you are digging into a creative project for the first time or you're struggling with something that you've been working on, hopefully today's lessons will help you move forward without making the same mistakes that I did. Before we begin digging into these 4 mistakes, I want to talk about one of my core principles. And this is a metric that I hold a lot of lessons in my life up to. It's this idea that we have 3 limited resources. And I've talked about it before on other videos, but the 3 limited resources that we all have are our time, our energy, and our money. And if you step back and just sort of think about those objectively, it all makes sense, right? You don't have an unlimited bank account. You only have 24 hours in a day. And at some point in the day, you are just utterly exhausted and you can't create anymore. And so as I point out these 4 mistakes that I've made, that I've seen other people make, keep in mind that the reason why I see them as mistakes is because they violate that core principle. They steal time or energy or finances from the most important thing to do things that are less important. Mistake number 1, putting money before content. I cannot tell you how many times at podcast conventions, at book signings, online, through email, through social media, people have approached me and they've said, I just launched a podcast. I'm super excited about it. We've got 1 episode out. We've had 12 downloads. And here's the link to my Patreon page or my merchandise store. Early on like that, when you've got 1 episode out, very little content, and not a lot of listeners, the last thing that you want to be doing is spending your time setting up a crowdfunding page or setting up an online store for merchandise. Now, let me be clear. I love seeing my artwork, my logo, my brands on merchandise. It is so fun. But you have to understand another principle that I hold to, and that is that if you have a group of followers, whether it's an audience, social media following, whatever it is, a group of followers, you can expect somewhere between 1% and 0.1% of those people to act on a call to action. So if you have 100 people in your audience and you say, I have shirts available, a good expectation is that 1 of them will buy. So early on, when you don't have a lot of listeners, you have to step back and do the math. If you only have 500 followers and 5 people buy t-shirts and you maybe make $2 or $3, profit on each shirt, you're not dealing with a lot of money at this point. It doesn't move the needle in terms of getting you to full-time work. So maybe don't focus on building a shop early on or building a Patreon page early on because there's not a lot of people out there to take you up on that offer. I think that most people, most podcasters, most authors, all those different places where merchandise and crowdfunding can come into the picture should probably wait until they hit that 1,000-person mark, and then gauge what the temperature is in there for merchandise, for supporting financially, because most people won't ever send you a penny. So my recommendation, if you're in this position, just wait. Be patient. It'll happen. Work right now on focusing all of your 3 limited resources, your finances, your time, and your energy, into what really matters in the early days of your podcast. More content, better content, and focus on generating the revenue later. Mistake number 2, paying for advertising. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I think it's self-explanatory. If your show isn't making money, you shouldn't be spending money you're not making on advertising. And let me back up and say, for those who are thinking, well, you have to spend money to make money, right? You have to invest in your show by putting ads out there to bring the listeners who will generate the revenue. It doesn't work. Advertising for podcasting doesn't work. I'm sorry. The number one, hands down, number one way to get new listeners is word of mouth advertising. It's the only way to do it. It is when your content is so good that the person who listened to it said, I have to share this with somebody else. And they go to a friend or a colleague or a family member who shares the same interests as them, and they say, hey, this show, I love this show, and I think you will too. And that sort of recommendation means a lot to that new person, and they say, oh, well, we share similar interests. I'll give that show a try. And they become a listener. That's how you grow your audience. So early on, don't spend money that you have a limited amount of on advertising when people have millions of podcasts out there to pick from. They're not going to pick yours based on an ad. I, in 7 years, have never subscribed to a show because I saw a paid ad. I've always subscribed to shows because they're recommended to me by friends with the same interests. So what you need to do instead of buying advertising is build moments into your podcast episodes where you say, hey, I would love if you would take a moment this week to tell 3 friends about this podcast. If you love it, if you are subscribed and you look forward to new episodes, it would really mean a lot if you would tell some of your friends and family members with similar interests that they too would enjoy this show. And that will grow your audience, and it grows it exponentially. So don't spend money on advertising. Ask for word of mouth. Beg for word of mouth. Ask your audience to get involved because they're the ones who grow your show. Mistake number 3, obsessing over equipment. Now, I'll be the first to tell you that I know that there are some mediums, some creative outlets where equipment is essential. Software, cameras, mics, all those things. It is essential to make the product, right? I have to go into my booth and record into a microphone using software to make my podcast. But when you've just started out, you have 1 or 2 or 3 episodes out, you only have a handful of downloads, you shouldn't be obsessing every day over whether you have the perfect microphone or whether the software you're using is just right for you. You need to focus on making. Okay, this is again about limited resources, limited time, limited energy. Focus on making content, getting better at making that content, because better content connects with more listeners. It makes them more likely to share it with friends and family and coworkers, and that's how you grow your show. Obsessing over equipment is fun. I love good product reviews. I love going on YouTube, typing in the name of a microphone or 2 microphones to see if there's a comparison video, and then watching things for an hour or hour and a half. It's a great way to lose your entire evening. And that's what you don't want to do. That time spent watching all those reviews or reading prices on Amazon or B&H or whatever it is, those moments that you're spending could have been used to make more content or to improve the content that you have. And so that's the priority choice that you have to make. Could I spend this time on my content, or could I waste it on something that's not actually going to move the needle right now for me? In the early days of making my first podcast, Lore, I recorded that on a pretty cheap, widely available microphone called the Yeti by Blue. I recorded it in a hardwood office with horsehair plaster walls and hard IKEA furniture. I sat the microphone directly in front of a glass iMac screen. Everything about what I did was horrible. And yet I brought in listeners because the content was good. People said, you've got to hear this. And as the audience grew and as I was able to earn revenue from the show, I then spent a bit of time to find a better microphone. I bought one about episode 7, and I am on roughly 191 right now, and it's the same microphone I've used since episode 7. So the idea here is, yes, spend a little bit of time once you get to that point, find the next piece of equipment that maybe levels up your content, and then walk away. Just make stuff. Just get better and better at making stuff. That's all you have to do. And lastly, mistake number 4, confusing low barrier to entry with low audience standards. Now, I know I just said that I put out 7 or 8 episodes on a bad microphone in a bad recording environment, but one of the mistakes that a lot of new podcasters make is that, well, because all I need is a microphone, I can just hold this phone up to my face and record my podcast and put it out, and it's just essentially a glorified, RSS-based voicemail. And that's not respectful to your listeners. So as you're making content, think about what's going to give your listeners, the people who tap that subscribe button, think about what's going to give them the best experience for that moment. People have a limited amount of time every day to listen to podcasts. For some people, it's their commute to work. Maybe it's an hour there and an hour back. And so they do the math, right? They look at the episode times in their app and they say, oh, I can fit an episode of that in, or I'll do 2 of that one right there. There's only so much time in the day to listen. You have to make your podcast worth being on their list. So don't treat being a podcaster like a lazy, half-assed, low barrier to entry sort of medium. Make something you're proud of. Make something that your listeners will be thankful they spent their time on. And you can do that by making your content better. Over time, you can increase the quality of the product, the quality of the audio, the quality of the music, whatever it is, the level of guests you bring in. But focus immediately not on, I'm just going to get it out there, but on how can I get it out there with what I have available in a way that respects my listeners. Because if you can respect them and give them what they deserve, they'll stick around. And that's how audiences grow. So there you go. 4 common mistakes that I and other podcasters I've watched make all the time. And hopefully you've learned from these mistakes and can avoid them yourself going forward. And if you have made some of these mistakes, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. If you think there are other mistakes that podcasters make, please add that into the comments. I'd love to hear about it. And obviously, clicking the subscribe button down below helps you stay notified when I have new content that's available. And you can take those lessons, those tips and tricks that I have in the future for you, and apply them as soon as possible to your own show. Thanks for watching. And until next time, go be creative. Oh, hey, you're still here? That's weird. I thought I faded out. Well, I have a 5th mistake that I can teach you about if you want to hear about it. Yeah? Okay, so mistake number 5, not treating the show that you want to be your full-time job someday like a full-time job. Honestly, pull on your big boy pants and be responsible. If you commit to putting out an episode of your podcast once a week, then do it, right? Like, who shows up in front of the TV on the night that their show is supposed to come out and just sits there and an announcement comes up and says, yeah, the A-team isn't going to be out tonight because we just didn't feel like putting an episode out, or we had a dentist appointment. Like, nobody does that. Be professional about this. If you're going to make a show and you're going to commit to a schedule, well, then follow the schedule. If you say you're going to put out a brand new episode of your show every other Tuesday afternoon, then you damn well better put out an episode of your show every other Tuesday afternoon. And let me tell you why. It comes down to disappointment. If your listener hears you say, or reads you in the description, say that your show is every other week or it's weekly, here's the day you can count on it to come out, they will set their schedules to it if they like your show. They'll say, oh man, that show that I like, it comes out on Tuesday mornings. That's my Tuesday morning commute to work podcast listen. Or that's my Tuesday afternoon in the gym listen. And when they show up and your episode isn't there, they get disappointed. And how many times do you think it's going to take for them to be disappointed before they say, screw this, I'm out of here, and they unsubscribe? The best way to retain your listeners is to be consistent. So there you go. Mistake number 5, not being a professional. You can do this. Treat it like it's a job, and maybe someday it will actually become your full-time job. All right, that's it. I'm out.